Have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force of cool collides with an immovable object of satire? What does it take to silence one of America's most influential and sharpest voices? It's a question that rarely gets a real answer. But in the fall of 2024, the world watched breathless as it unfolded live on air. This isn't a story about a witty debate or a heated argument. This is the story of a cultural detonation, a confrontation so profound and so personal that it didn't just end an interview, it ended an entire television institution. It's the story of how the legendary Samuel L. Jackson, a man whose presence can fill a stadium, faced off against Jon Stewart, the reigning king of political comedy in a battle of conviction versus cynicism. And in the end, only one of them was left standing. The night didn't conclude with laughs or applause, but with a deafening silence that echoed from a New York studio all the way to the highest floors of a television network, resulting in an outcome no one could have ever predicted: the cancellation of The Daily Show. This is the anatomy of that takedown. The stage for this monumental clash was the familiar, almost sacred ground of Studio 7H, at 733 11th Avenue in New York City, the home of The Daily Show. It was a crisp Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of New York night where the air bites with the promise of winter, and the city's energy feels electric, humming with purpose. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a carefully controlled bubble of blue-hued lighting, buzzing monitors, and the low, expectant murmur of a live studio audience. The air conditioning kept the space a cool 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark contrast to the heat that was about to be generated. For Jon Stewart, this was his fortress. Having returned to the host's chair earlier in the year, he had settled back into his rhythm with the comfortable ease of a man reclaiming his throne. He was sharp, his wit honed by years of dissecting the absurdities of American politics. His mindset on this particular evening was one of confident preparation. He felt he had the upper hand. His guest was Samuel L. Jackson, a cinematic icon. Yes, but also in Stewart's view, a known quantity. The interview plan, meticulously crafted by his team of writers, was simple. Start with some lighthearted banter about Jackson's prolific career, segue into a plug for his new highly anticipated film, and then pivot to the real meat, using Jackson as a cultural barometer to land a few well-aimed jabs at the current political landscape. Stewart, thumbing through his blue index cards, saw Jackson not as a collaborator in a conversation, but as a colorful prop for his own brand of commentary. He was prepared, he was comfortable, and he was in his own mind untouchable. He failed to understand that the man who was about to walk onto his stage was not merely an actor. He was a force of nature operating with a gravity all his own. Backstage, Samuel L. Jackson was a study in controlled intensity. He wasn't nervous, but he was focused. He had agreed to this interview for one reason, and one reason only: to discuss The Raleigh Echo, a film he had spent the better part of a decade trying to get made. It was his passion project, the story of Josiah King, a forgotten hero of the civil rights movement whose quiet, relentless activism in North Carolina had changed thousands of lives but never made the history books. For Jackson, this wasn't just another role. It was a debt. It was a legacy. He had poured his own money, his own soul into this project. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a dark purple shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a look that was effortlessly commanding. As he waited in the green room, a small, sterile space with a worn-out couch and a television broadcasting the show's opening monologue, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A young, eager producer had run through the pre-interview questions, and Jackson detected a faint note of condescension, a hint that the show's primary interest wasn't in the substance of his film, but in its potential as fodder for comedy. He had navigated the treacherous waters of Hollywood and the media for over 40 years. He knew the difference between respect and veiled mockery. He sat there, a silent storm gathering behind his eyes, sensing that he hadn't come here for a conversation, but for a fight. He just didn't know how right he was. The interview began, as most do on The Daily Show, with a torrent of applause and a warm, disarming smile from Jon Stewart. The first few minutes were a masterclass in talk show pleasantries. Stewart lauded Jackson's iconic status, and they shared a laugh about a behind-the-scenes anecdote from one of Jackson's blockbuster films. The audience was eating it up, lulled into a sense of familiar comfort. Jackson was polite, engaged, but his responses were economical, precise. He was a lion, reserving his energy, observing the terrain. The shift when it came was subtle, but decisive. Stewart leaned forward, a glint in his eye that his viewers knew well. It was the look he got right before he went in for the kill. "Sam," he began, the casual familiarity a calculated tool. "You've been in over 150 movies. You are arguably the most ubiquitous actor in modern history. At a certain point when you get a script, does the story even matter? Or is the project just the Samuel L. Jackson experience featuring a plot?" The question hung in the air, coated in a thin veneer of humor, but its subtext was sharp. It questioned his artistry, his discernment, his very craft. The audience chuckled, as programmed. Jackson, however, did not. He didn't get angry. He got still. He held Stewart's gaze for a beat too long, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "The story is the only thing that matters, Jon," Jackson said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the studio's lighthearted buzz. "Every character, every line is a piece of a larger narrative. My job is to serve that narrative. It seems you and I have a different approach to storytelling. You deconstruct it. I try to build it." The comeback was so swift and so sharp that a wave of oohs rippled through the audience. Stewart's smile tightened. He had expected a playful jab back, not a philosophical dissection of his entire comedic premise. He felt the control of the interview slipping, and he did what he always did. When cornered, he doubled down, this time with more pointed cynicism. He pivoted to Jackson's new film. "Okay, let's talk about building something. The Raleigh Echo. A powerful historical drama, I'm sure. But we've seen a lot of these prestige pictures. They come out in the fall. They deal with heavy themes. Is this the one you're hoping finally snags you that Best Actor Oscar? Is that the play here?" And there it was, the ultimate insult. It wasn't just a dig at Jackson. It was a complete and utter dismissal of his passion, of Josiah King's legacy, reducing a decade of heartfelt work to a cynical, self-serving awards campaign. The air in the studio turned cold. The audience's laughter died in their throats. Jackson's calm demeanor finally fractured, not with rage, but with a profound, chilling disappointment. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on his knees, his eyes boring into Stewart. The hunter had just become the hunted. "The play," Jackson repeated the words, slowly tasting their bitter arrogance. "Let me ask you something, Jon. What's your play? Every night you sit behind this desk and you throw stones. You mock, you ridicule, you tear down. And you're good at it. It's made you famous. It's made you a trusted voice. But what have you ever built? What story have you ever told that didn't rely on the failures or shortcomings of others? You talk about my play for an award. My play, Jon, is to tell a story that matters. My play is to shine a light on a man whose life was a testament to courage, a man you've probably never even heard of. You think this is about a gold statue, this is about history, and you're treating it like it's a punchline." The studio was now utterly silent. The power dynamic had been irrevocably inverted. Samuel L. Jackson was no longer the guest on The Daily Show. He was now its interrogator, and Jon Stewart had no answers. The atmosphere on set had become so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. Jon Stewart, for the first time in his celebrated career, looked genuinely lost. He was a master of controlling the narrative, but the narrative had been ripped from his hands. His face, usually a canvas for wry amusement, was pale. He tried to recover, to fall back on his most reliable tool, deflective intellectual humor. It would be the single greatest miscalculation of his professional life. All right, tough crowd," he stammered, attempting a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I'm being too cynical. Let's see a piece of this story you're so passionate about." He turned to the monitor. "Let's roll the clip from The Raleigh Echo." On the giant screen behind them, a scene flickered to life. It was a powerful, emotionally charged moment from the film. Jackson as Josiah King was delivering a quiet but gut-wrenching speech to a small group of parishioners in a dusty church, his face a mask of grief and steely resolve. The cinematic quality was undeniable, the performance raw and captivating. For 30 seconds, the audience was mesmerized. And then, the ultimate act of disrespect. Just as the on-screen Jackson finished his line, the clip abruptly cut. It was immediately followed by a jarring, out-of-context snippet from Snakes on a Plane. There was Jackson years younger, his face contorted in mock terror, screaming his infamous expletive-laden line about the titular reptiles. The edit was deliberately crude, designed for maximum comedic whiplash. Stewart turned back to the camera, a smug look returning to his face, believing he had cleverly re-established his dominance. "Talk about range," he quipped. "From civil rights to snake flights. It's quite the—" He never got to finish the sentence. The sound that came from Samuel L. Jackson wasn't a yell. It was the low, resonant rumble of an earthquake, starting deep within the earth. He didn't rise from his chair. He seemed to grow in it, his presence suddenly immense, suffocating the studio. He looked at Stewart, but his gaze was vacant, as if he were looking straight through him at something far more offensive. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of all warmth, a blade of pure, cold fury. "You think that was clever?" He said the words perfectly articulated, each one a hammer blow. "You think that was satire?" He slowly shook his head, a look of profound pity mixing with the anger. "You sit there on your throne made of irony and you judge the world. But irony is the refuge of a man who has nothing sincere to say. It's the armor of a coward, afraid to believe in anything because it might be proven wrong. You didn't just disrespect me. I can handle that. I've been in this business for 40 years. You disrespected the memory of a man who fought and bled for the very freedoms that allow you to sit here and broadcast your cheap, lazy cynicism to the world." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the dead air. The production team in the control booth was frozen, their hands hovering over buttons, unsure of what to do. This was no longer a show. It was a reckoning. "You want to talk about the play?" Jackson continued, his voice rising just enough to command absolute authority. "People like Josiah King, they built things. They built movements. They built hope where there was none. People like me, we try to build stories, to honor them, to make sure they're not forgotten. All you do, Jon, is throw rocks at the builders. And tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, "you threw a rock at a cathedral because you were too blind to see it was anything more than just another wall." With that, Samuel L. Jackson stood up, not in a storm, but in a state of grace. He deliberately and with immense care unclipped the microphone from his suit jacket. He leaned over and placed it gently on Stewart's desk next to the useless blue index cards. He didn't look at Stewart again. He turned his body and looked directly into the lens of the main camera, speaking not to the studio, but to the world, to the network executives watching in their corner offices. "Your platform," he said, his voice unwavering, "has been used tonight to mock history and to belittle legacy. For that there must be a consequence." He turned and walked off the stage. The camera followed him until he disappeared into the darkness backstage. The applause sign remained unlit. The only sound was the hum of the studio lights. The immediate aftermath was chaos, cloaked in silence. As Jackson disappeared from view, The live feed cut abruptly to a commercial for a fast food chain, a surreal juxtaposition that only amplified the raw intensity of the preceding moments. On set, Jon Stewart remained frozen at his desk, the carefully placed microphone a damning indictment before him. His face was ashen, the mask of the witty provocateur completely gone, replaced by the stunned, hollow look of a man who had just witnessed his own public dismantling. The audience, which had been instructed to remain seated, began to murmur, then to talk in hushed, shocked tones. There was no laughter, no analysis, just a collective sense of having witnessed something profoundly real and deeply uncomfortable. The floor manager, speaking softly into his headset, finally gave the signal, and the crowd filed out, not with the usual post-show buzz, but with the somber quiet of people leaving a funeral. Within an hour, the clip, not the edited one Stewart had planned, but the raw footage of Jackson's speech, was everywhere. It wasn't just viral. It was a cultural singularity. The hashtag consequence, for Stewart trended globally. Jackson's words were being quoted, analyzed, and overwhelmingly supported. Op-eds were being written in real time. Actors, directors, historians, and even politicians weighed in, almost universally condemning Stewart's actions as a step too far, a gross misapplication of satire's purpose. Satire is meant to punch up at the powerful and the hypocritical. Stewart, in his arrogance, had punched down at something sacred, a story of genuine historical importance and the passionate conviction of the artist telling it. The executives at Paramount Global Comedy Central's parent company convened an emergency meeting before dawn the next day. The discussion was grim. This wasn't about a single bad interview or a celebrity feud. This was about brand identity. Samuel L. Jackson was not just a star. He was a revered cultural institution, a figure who commanded immense respect across demographics. The Daily Show under Stewart was a valuable asset, but it was now a toxic one. Sponsors were calling threatening to pull millions in advertising. The public outcry was deafening. A hastily written apology issued by the network, and Stewart was seen as what it was, a weak corporate attempt at damage control that failed to grasp the gravity of the offense. Jackson remained silent, his actions having said everything that needed to be said. The consequence he had promised was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability. The decision, when it came, was swift and brutal. In a terse press release that afternoon, Paramount Global announced that The Daily Show with Jon Stewart would be going on an indefinite hiatus to reevaluate the show's creative direction. Everyone knew what indefinite hiatus meant. It was a corporate execution. The throne of irony was now vacant. The lesson from the fallout was stark and clear. Conviction is a currency that cynicism can never devalue. In a world saturated with mockery and critique, sincerity, when wielded with righteous anger and purpose, is the ultimate power. Jon Stewart tried to make Samuel L. Jackson a punchline in his story, but instead Samuel L. Jackson made Jon Stewart a footnote in a much larger, more important one about respect, legacy, and the soul of storytelling. Now we turn the question over to you. Was Samuel L. Jackson's walk-off an act of necessary defiance, a moment where a line had to be drawn in the sand against the pervasive tide of empty cynicism? Or was it an overreaction? A case where a comedian's failed joke was met with a disproportionate consequence? Where do you believe the line exists between biting satire and outright disrespect? This is a conversation that goes to the heart of our media landscape, and your perspective is a vital part of it. Share your thoughts, your analysis, and your feelings in the comments section below. We want to hear what you think. If this deep dive into a pivotal cultural moment resonated with you, if it made you think, then please give this video a like and share it with others who appreciate complex stories. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more content that goes beyond the headlines to uncover the powerful narratives that shape our world. The ultimate lesson from that fateful night is one we should all carry with us. A voice built on genuine conviction will always, in the end, be louder and more powerful than a voice built on clever cynicism. Authenticity isn't just a trait, it's a superpower. Don't be afraid to use yours.